You think your grandmother's kitchen skills were just old-fashioned cooking tips? Think again. What she knew without measuring the difference between feeding a family by Thursday, these 30 unwritten rules weren't helpful hints. They were survival math that stretched impossible budgets when one burnt pot meant hungry children.
To prepare lamb loaf, just add minced onions, dry breadcrumbs, a little evaporated or fresh milk, and seasoning to a pound of ground lamb.
From testing oven heat by holding your hand inside to salvaging burnt gravy by instinct, she possessed sensory mastery and modern recipes erased. Tonight, we're dragging these disappearing secrets back before the last generation who mastered them is gone. She fed 8 people on less than your coffee costs. These weren't tricks, they were survival engineering. Here is number 1. Inside, grandmother tested oven heat every morning in 1958, survival-driven baking practice that used hand sensitivity for determining temperature before reliable oven thermometers existed in home kitchens. She opened oven doors, held her hand inside at chest height, counting seconds until heat became unbearable. Knew that 5 seconds meant slow oven for meringues, 3 seconds meant moderate for cakes, 1 second meant hot for bread. The kitchen featured gas or electric ovens with unreliable temperature dials that drifted 50 degrees from indicated settings, no oven thermometers, hand testing as only reliable method, scarred hands from years of heat exposure proving baking experience. The hand test was immediate, accurate, painful, with heat radiating against palm and fingers. The sensation ranged from warm, tolerable for slow ovens to searing, unbearable for hot bread ovens. Grandmother kneaded bread every Wednesday in 1962, survival-driven tactile practice that used hand sensitivity for determining gluten development without timers or written instructions. She kneaded dough on floured counters for unknown minutes, felt texture transformation from shaggy sticky to smooth elastic, pressed dough with fingertips checking springback that indicated proper gluten formation, knew instantly when dough was ready without consulting recipes that said, "Knead 10 minutes," because her hands told her completion. The perfectly kneaded dough was smooth, silky, elastic, with surface that bounced back when pressed. The texture was supple, alive, warm from yeast activity and mechanical development. It cost nothing. Tactile knowledge developed through thousands of loaves, saving recipe consultation time and preventing over-kneading that destroyed texture. It demonstrated your bread expertise when dough feeling proved you understood gluten development through sensory feedback rather than following arbitrary time measurements that ignored dough variables like flour, protein content, and ambient temperature. Grandmother tested meat doneness every Sunday in 1965, survival-driven tactile practice that used finger pressure for determining internal temperature without thermometers or cutting into roasts. She pressed roasting meat with index finger, compared resistance to pressing her own palm near thumb for rare, center of palm for medium, base of thumb for well done, knew instantly whether meat needed more cooking without piercing surface and losing juices. The finger test was immediate, accurate, tactile, with meat resistance indicating internal temperature. Rare meat felt soft yielding like relaxed palm muscle. Well done felt firm resistant like flexed thumb base. It cost nothing. Built-in doneness gauge using hand comparison. It proved your cooking expertise when finger testing demonstrated you understood meat doneness through comparative touch rather than depending on thermometers that working kitchens often lacked. Finger testing continues among professional chefs, though home cooks rely on thermometers. The skill that once proved cooking mastery remains professional technique, something culinary schools teach, but home cooks never develop, because instant red thermometers provide certainty without requiring years of practice calibrating finger pressure against internal temperatures. Grandmother rescued burnt stew every Tuesday in 1963, survival-driven salvage practice that used careful transfer for saving scorched food without wasting entire batches. She detected burning smell immediately, removed pot from heat, carefully spooned unburnt portions into clean pot, avoiding bottom layer, added fresh liquid to dilute slight burnt taste, served salvaged stew without mentioning the near disaster that almost wasted family supper. The salvage technique was quick, careful, practiced with experience, teaching exactly how deep to scrape before hitting burnt layer. The saved food tasted normal, acceptable, with only faint smoke, hint that family learned to ignore. It cost nothing, saved $2 of ingredients, equivalent to $18 today. It demonstrated your household management when salvaging proved you wouldn't waste food from momentary inattention, when throwing out burnt stew meant children eating bread for supper and family going hungry until next shopping day. Food salvaging decreased when abundance eliminated necessity in the 1980s, and throwing out mistakes became acceptable. Grandmother extended meatloaf every Thursday in 1966, survival-driven ratio practice that used visual assessment for adding filler without measuring cups or written proportions. She mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs by sight, added handfuls until mixture looked right. 1/3 filler seemed correct. Stretched 1 pound into 6 servings through practiced eye for volume and texture that required no measuring tools. The stretched meat was firm, dense filling with breadcrumbs invisible in final product. The ratio was perfect, economical, undetectable, making cheap meatloaf taste like pure beef. It cost nothing. Visual calculation saved 50 cents per pound, equivalent to $6 today. It proved your multiplication mathematics when eyeball measuring demonstrated you understood filler ratios through visual experience rather than following written recipes that required measuring cups. Working kitchens often didn't own. Visual ratio knowledge vanished when written recipes became standard in the 1970s and measuring tools became universal kitchen equipment. The skill that once proved cooking expertise became lost knowledge, something modern cooks cannot replicate because recipe dependence eliminated need to develop visual assessment of ingredient ratios learned through years of stretching expensive proteins with cheap fillers. These first 5 kitchen instincts weren't just old-fashioned techniques. They were survival engineering that eliminated dependence on equipment working families couldn't afford when one burnt pot meant wasted ingredients and hungry children. They required tactile sensitivity developed through thousands of repetitions that couldn't be transmitted through written instructions because the knowledge lived in hands rather than paper. Grandmother refreshed bread every morning in 1964. Survival-driven moisture practice that used water and heat for restoring freshness to day-old bread without wasting it. She sprinkled stale bread with water drops, wrapped it in clean towels, placed it in warm ovens for 10 minutes, removed it, transformed into fresh-tasting bread with moisture redistributed through heating that reversed staling process. The revived bread was soft, fresh, warm, with crust regaining crispness and interior moisture restored. The texture was nearly new, acceptable for daily use. It cost nothing, saved 20 cents per loaf daily, equivalent to $3 today. It demonstrated your household management when bread reviving proved you understood starch retrogradation reversal through moisture and heat rather than throwing out day-old bread when working families couldn't afford daily fresh loaves. Bread reviving decreased when sliced bread and preservatives extended shelf life in the 1970s, and abundance made day-old bread acceptable to discard. The skill that once proved resourcefulness became forgotten technique, something modern households don't practice because cheap, abundant bread makes stale loaf disposal preferable to spending time reviving yesterday's bread that cost only $2 to replace. Grandmother tested frying oil every Friday in 1967, survival-driven temperature practice that used flour drops for determining readiness without thermometers measuring 350, 375 degrees needed for proper frying. She sprinkled pinches of flour into heating oil, watched reaction speed. Immediate sizzle meant ready, slow bubbling meant too cool, smoking meant too hot. Adjusted heat accordingly through observation rather than measurement. The flour test was immediate visual accurate with sizzle intensity indicating proper temperature. Ready oil made flour dance and brown in seconds without burning. It cost nothing. Instant feedback using pantry ingredient, saving $8 for thermometer equivalent to $60 today. It proved your frying expertise when flour testing demonstrated you understood oil temperature through observation rather than depending on thermometers that working kitchens rarely had for deep frying. Flour testing continues among experienced cooks, though thermometers became standard equipment. The skill that once proved cooking mastery remains valid technique, something older cooks remember, but younger generations never learn because clip-on thermometers provide precise readings without requiring practiced observation of flour behavior in hot oil. Grandmother rescued lumpy gravy every Sunday in 1961, survival-driven salvage practice that used cold water and whisking for smoothing separated or lumpy gravy without starting over. She detected gravy problems immediately. Lumps from insufficient stirring or separation from overheating. Added tablespoons of cold water while whisking vigorously, incorporated water that thinned gravy and allowed lumps to dissolve, reheated gently until proper consistency returned through practiced stirring technique. The fixed gravy was smooth, silky, proper, with lumps disappeared and separation reversed. The texture was correct. Professional, identical to gravy made perfectly from start. It cost nothing. Saved gravy batch worth $1, equivalent to $9 today. It demonstrated your cooking expertise when gravy fixing proved you understood emulsion chemistry and starch behavior through intuitive correction rather than accepting failure that meant serving meat without gravy or starting over and delaying entire meal. Gravy salvaging decreased when packaged gravy mixes eliminated failure risk in the 1970s, and abundance made starting over acceptable. The skill that once proved cooking mastery became unnecessary. Something modern cooks rarely develop because discarding failed gravy and using jar gravy seems preferable to learning correction techniques that require understanding sauce chemistry. Grandmother tested eggs every morning in 1968, survival-driven freshness practice that used water density for determining age and safety without expiration dates printed on cartons. She filled bowls with cold water, gently placed eggs in water, observed floating behavior. Fresh eggs sank flat, week-old tilted upward. Old floated completely, meaning discard, knew instantly which eggs were safe through air cell expansion that occurred with aging. The float test was instant, accurate, reliable, with floating indicating air cell growth from moisture loss through porous shells. Fresh eggs stayed bottom flat, proving recent laying. It cost nothing. Safety check using water, preventing illness from spoiled eggs worth 20 cents equivalent to $3 today. It proved your household knowledge when egg testing demonstrated you understood food safety through observation rather than depending on dates that farms didn't provide and stores didn't track. Egg float testing continues as valid technique, though expiration dates became standard in 1970s. The skill that once proved food safety knowledge remains useful practice, something older generations remember and modern homesteaders use, but mainstream cooks ignore because printed dates seem more reliable than traditional testing, despite float test being scientifically accurate. Grandmother cooled pies every Saturday in 1965, survival-driven temperature practice that used windowsill drafts for achieving perfect cooling without refrigeration that made crusts soggy. She placed hot pies on windowsills in specific weather conditions, cool but not cold days, windows cracked for airflow but not wide open, knew exact cooling rate that set fillings without condensation, forming that ruined bottom crusts through practiced observation of seasonal cooling patterns. The windowsill cooling was precise, practiced, seasonal, with grandmother understanding exactly which windows at what times of year provided perfect cooling rates. Proper cooling made fillings set firmly while crusts stayed crisp. It cost nothing. Strategic use of ambient temperature, maintaining pie quality worth $1 equivalent to $9 today. Grandmother cleaned hands after onions in 1969, survival-driven odor practice that used salt abrasion for removing sulfur compounds that soap couldn't eliminate. She rubbed wet hands with coarse salt, scrubbed vigorously for 30 seconds, rinsed with cold water, repeated if necessary until onion smell disappeared through mechanical removal of sulfur compounds embedded in skin oils that water alone couldn't wash away. The salt scrub was abrasive, effective, immediate, with salt crystals mechanically removing odor molecules. Hands emerged clean, neutral, smooth, without onion smell that otherwise lasted hours. It cost pennies in salt, eliminated smell that marked you as housewife who couldn't manage basic cleanliness. It proved your household knowledge when salt scrubbing demonstrated you understood odor chemistry rather than accepting that onion smell meant avoiding social situations until natural dissipation occurred hours later. Salt hand scrubbing continues as valid technique, though stainless steel rubbing became popular alternative. The skill that once proved kitchen competence remains useful practice, something experienced cooks remember but modern cooks never learn, because accepting temporary onion smell seems preferable to keeping salt by the sink specifically for hand scrubbing. Grandmother stored tomatoes stem down in 1966. Survival-driven preservation practice that used orientation for preventing moisture loss and extending shelf life without refrigeration that destroyed tomato texture and flavor. She placed tomatoes stem side down on counters, understood that gravity pulled moisture toward stem scar, and inverted position prevented air entry through picking wound that accelerated spoilage, kept tomatoes fresh 3 extra days through simple positioning. The stem-down storage was simple, effective, scientific with positioning, preventing moisture loss through stem scar. Tomatoes stayed firm, fresh, flavorful days longer than stem-up storage. It cost nothing. Extended tomato life, saving 20 cents per pound, equivalent to $3 today. It demonstrated your food preservation knowledge when stem positioning proved you understood moisture dynamics rather than randomly placing tomatoes and accepting faster spoilage that meant wasting produce working families couldn't afford to discard. Grandmother softened sugar overnight in 1963. Survival-driven moisture practice that used apple slices for restoring hardened brown sugar without microwaves or heating that modern solutions require. She placed apple slices in containers with hardened brown sugar, sealed containers overnight, removed apple slices next morning, revealing soft, usable sugar through moisture transfer that rehydrated dried molasses coating without adding water that dissolved sugar. The apple softening was slow, reliable, complete with apple moisture. Rehydrating sugar overnight, hardened blocks became soft, scoopable, perfect, without clumping or dissolving. It cost nothing, saved 50-cent boxes of hardened sugar, equivalent to $6 today. It proved your household knowledge when apple softening demonstrated you understood moisture, equilibrium, rather than throwing out hardened sugar when working families couldn't waste ingredients because of storage failures. Grandmother tested cakes with straw in 1964, survival-driven assessment practice that used broom straws for determining doneness without toothpicks that rural kitchens rarely had. She pulled single straw from broom, inserted it into cake center, withdrew it, observing whether straw emerged clean, indicating done, or sticky, indicating more baking needed, knew instantly without expensive cake testers or wasting toothpicks that Depression-era habits said were too valuable to use once and discard. The straw test was accurate, free, immediate, with clean straw indicating proper doneness. The technique worked identically to toothpick, but used renewable resource from household broom. It cost nothing, used existing tool, saving toothpick expense of 5 cents per box, equivalent to 70 cents today. It demonstrated your resourcefulness when straw testing proved you solved problems using available materials rather than depending on specialized tools that working kitchens couldn't afford or rural stores didn't stock. Grandmother stored cookies with bread in 1967, survival-driven moisture practice that used bread slices for maintaining cookie softness through moisture transfer that prevented drying and hardening. She placed white bread slices in cookie jars with fresh-baked cookies, sealed containers, replaced bread every 3 days when it dried out from transferring moisture to cookies, kept cookies soft, chewy, fresh for weeks through continuous moisture supply. The bread storage was simple, effective. Renewable with bread moisture preventing cookie hardening, cookies stayed soft, perfect fresh, without becoming dry, crumbly bricks. It cost pennies in bread slices, maintained cookie quality worth $2 per batch. These first 15 kitchen instincts weren't just clever tricks. They were strategic household management that eliminated waste and extended food life when one spoiled ingredient meant meal failure and hungry family. They required understanding of moisture dynamics, chemical reactions, and physics principles that grandmother couldn't explain scientifically, but knew intuitively through decades of observation and transmitted through demonstration rather than written instruction, because the knowledge was tactile and sensory rather than verbal. The next 5 represent even more specialized instinctual knowledge. Techniques using precise timing, seasonal awareness, and chemical testing. When proving you were accomplished, Cook meant understanding food science through experience rather than education. Grandmother wrapped celery in foil in 1968, survival-driven preservation practice that used aluminum wrapping for maintaining crispness through ethylene gas containment that plastic couldn't provide. She wrapped celery stalks tightly in aluminum foil immediately after purchase, stored wrapped celery in refrigerator crisper drawers, kept celery crisp, fresh, crunchy for 3 weeks compared to 1 week in plastic bags that trapped moisture causing rot, while failing to contain ethylene that triggered wilting. The foil wrapping was simple, counterintuitive, effective, with aluminum blocking ethylene while allowing some air circulation. Celery stayed crisp, green, fresh weeks beyond normal storage life. It cost pennies in foil, extended celery life, saving 30 cents per bunch, equivalent to $4 today. It demonstrated your storage knowledge when foil wrapping proved you understood produce physiology rather than using plastic bags that seemed more modern but actually accelerated spoilage through moisture accumulation. Grandmother stored marshmallows with sugar in 1965, survival-driven moisture practice that used marshmallow humidity for preventing brown sugar hardening through continuous moisture release. She placed several large marshmallows in brown sugar containers, sealed lids, left marshmallows permanently as moisture source that kept sugar soft, scoopable fresh indefinitely through moisture equilibrium that prevented molasses coating from drying and hardening sugar into unusable rocks. The marshmallow storage was permanent effective, renewable, with marshmallows slowly releasing moisture without dissolving sugar. Brown sugar stayed soft, perfect ready, without hardening that plagued paper-packaged products. It cost 20 cents in marshmallows, prevented hardening of dollar boxes, equivalent to $12 today. Grandmother salted eggplant by feel in 1966. Survival-driven preparation practice that used salt extraction for removing bitter compounds through osmotic dehydration, knowing by touch exactly when moisture beads indicated complete extraction. She sliced eggplant, salted slices generously, waited until moisture beads formed on surfaces indicating bitter compounds extracted, wiped slices clean, knew instantly by moisture amount when eggplant was ready for cooking through tactile assessment rather than timed waiting. The salt extraction was tactile, precise, intuitive, with moisture bead formation indicating completion. Properly salted eggplant was mild, sweet, tender without bitterness that made unsalted eggplant inedible. It cost pennies in salt, transformed 40-cent eggplant into edible vegetable, equivalent to $5 today. Grandmother tested candy by water drop in 1962, survival-driven temperature practice that used cold water tests for determining exact candy stages without thermometers measuring 234,300-degree ranges needed for proper candy making. She dropped candy syrup into cold water, tested resulting texture with fingers. Soft ball for fudge, hard ball for caramels, hard crack for brittles, knew instantly what temperature syrup had reached through tactile assessment of cooled candy behavior that corresponded precisely to thermometer readings. The water test was accurate tactile practiced, with candy texture indicating exact temperature. Soft ball felt pliable, moldable, indicating 234, 240 degrees, perfect for fudge. It cost nothing. Precise temperature knowledge using water, saving $8 for candy thermometer, equivalent to $70 today. It proved your candy expertise when water testing demonstrated you understood sugar chemistry through tactile experience rather than depending on thermometers that working kitchens couldn't afford, and Depression-era habits said were unnecessary luxury. Grandmother revived lettuce daily in 1969, survival-driven restoration practice that used ice water immersion for restoring crispness to wilted lettuce through cellular rehydration that required precise timing. Grandmother determined through tactile observation. She submerged wilted lettuce leaves in large bowls filled with ice water immediately upon discovering the wilting, ensuring complete submersion, so every leaf contacted cold water that would drive moisture back into dehydrated cells through osmotic pressure. Waited exactly 15 minutes as her standard baseline while monitoring texture recovery through periodic gentle pressing to assess firmness returning to leaves. Removed lettuce at the precise moment when cells regained turgor pressure, making leaves crisp again, but before excessive water absorption occurred that would make leaves waterlogged and mushy rather than crisp. She dried revived leaves thoroughly using clean dish towels or letting them drain in wire baskets, knowing that excess surface water would wilt the lettuce again and dilute salad dressing, producing lettuce that emerged crisp, fresh, perfect, and virtually indistinguishable from newly purchased heads through practiced timing that couldn't be written as exact minutes, because variables including wilting severity, leaf thickness, lettuce variety, and ice water temperature all affected revival speed requiring grandmother's experienced assessment rather than blind adherence to arbitrary time limit. The ice water revival was carefully timed, practiced, effective, with 15 minutes being average duration, but grandmother constantly adjusting based on tactile observation and visual assessment of leaf recovery, gently pressing leaves every 5 minutes to monitor crispness, returning as cells rehydrated, judging completion through experienced touch that detected the exact moment when maximum crispness was achieved before over-soaking began. The revived lettuce was intensely crisp, cold, fresh, with texture indistinguishable from newly purchased lettuce, the leaves regaining their characteristic snap and crunch that wilting had destroyed. And the cold temperature from ice water made the lettuce even more refreshing than room temperature fresh lettuce. The technique worked because wilted lettuce wasn't actually damaged or spoiled. It had simply lost water through evaporation and transpiration, and reintroducing water through osmotic pressure allowed plant cells to refill and regain the turgor pressure that created crispness, making revival possible where modern cooks assumed wilting meant the lettuce was ruined and required disposal. Grandmother understood this instinctively without knowing the scientific explanation, recognizing through observation that wilted lettuce could be saved if caught before actual decay set in, and that ice water worked better than room temperature water because the cold temperature helped crisp the leaves while the water rehydrated them. It cost nothing beyond ice and water, saved 30 cents per head of wilted lettuce, equivalent to $4 today. It demonstrated your household knowledge and food preservation expertise when lettuce reviving proved you understood plant cell biology through intuitive rehydration rather than throwing out wilted produce, and showed you recognized that wilting was reversible dehydration rather than irreversible spoilage, allowing you to salvage vegetables that working families couldn't afford to waste because of storage failures or delayed meal preparation that left lettuce wilting in refrigerators before use. These first 20 kitchen instincts weren't just useful techniques. They were evidence of observational learning that transmitted knowledge through demonstration across generations when one failed dish meant wasted ingredients and one spoiled vegetable meant insufficient dinner portions. They required sensory awareness that couldn't be described in words, timing precision that varied with conditions, and chemical understanding that existed as instinct rather than education, because grandmother learned by watching her mother, who learned from her mother in unbroken chain of practical knowledge that died when written recipes replaced observation as primary teaching method. The next 5 represent the deepest instinctual knowledge, techniques so fundamental that explaining them seemed impossible when the skills were embedded in hands and intuition rather than conscious thought. Grandmother rendered lard every Saturday in 1961, survival-driven fat practice that used auditory and olfactory monitoring for extracting pure fat from meat scraps without thermometers or timers, knowing by sound and smell exactly when rendering completed and when overheating risked burning. She heated pork fat scraps in cast iron pots, listened for sizzling intensity changes indicating moisture evaporation stages, smelled for nutty aroma shift that meant approaching completion, removed pots from heat at precise moment when sound quieted and smell peaked, indicating maximum fat extraction, before burning began through sensory monitoring that required no measurement tools or written guidance. The rendering process was auditory-olfactory practiced, with sound progressing from violent bubbling to gentle sizzle to near silence, indicating completion stages. Smell evolved from raw porky to toasted nutty to warning sharp if heating continued too long. The final rendered lard was pure white smooth without burnt flavor that resulted from overheating, And grandmother's timing was instinctive through decades of listening and smelling that taught her exactly when rendering finished without ever consulting temperature or time. It cost nothing beyond fuel, transformed 40 cents of fat scraps into 1 pound rendered lard, equivalent to $6 today. It demonstrated your rendering expertise when sensory monitoring proved you understood fat extraction through sound and smell rather than following temperature and time instructions that couldn't account for variables like fat quality and thickness affecting rendering speed, and that ignored the reality that most kitchens lacked precise temperature control, making sensory assessment the only reliable method. Grandmother proofed yeast by observation in 1964, survival-driven fermentation practice that used foam assessment for determining yeast viability and activity level without thermometers, knowing by foam height and bubble formation whether yeast was active enough for bread or dead from age or temperature that would cause bread failure. She mixed yeast with warm water and sugar, observed foam development over 5 to 10 minutes, assessed foam quality through height and bubble texture that indicated fermentation strength. Vigorous foam meant proceed, weak foam meant discard, and try fresh yeast. No foam meant temperature-killed yeast or age rendered it inactive, made instant judgment through visual assessment that prevented hours of work on dough that wouldn't rise because dead yeast couldn't ferment. The yeast proofing was visual-timed instinctive, with foam reaching quarter-inch height, indicating proper activity. Grandmother knowing instantly whether foam quality suggested strong rise or weak performance that meant bread failure. The assessment included bubble size. Small, uniform bubbles meant healthy fermentation, large, irregular bubbles suggested struggling yeast, and foam texture that she evaluated through appearance rather than measurement, making split-second decision about whether to proceed or start over with fresh yeast. It cost nothing, prevented wasted ingredients from dead yeast, saving 50 cents in flour and time equivalent to $6 today. It demonstrated your bread expertise when foam assessment proved you understood yeast biology through visual observation rather than assuming packet yeast was always viable or that written proofing times applied regardless of yeast condition and water temperature that grandmother adjusted instinctively based on foam development speed. Grandmother tested jelly by sheeting in 1963, survival-driven preservation practice that used metal spoon observation for determining pectin gel point without thermometers measuring 222 degrees needed for proper jelly formation. She dipped cold metal spoons into boiling jelly, tilted spoons observing how liquid ran off edge. Early cooking produced separate drops. Proper gel point produced sheet, where 2 drops merged and fell as one. Overcooking produced too thick sheet that meant tough rubbery jelly instead of tender gel. Knew instantly when jelly reached perfect consistency through practiced observation of liquid behavior that corresponded exactly to temperature and pectin concentration. The sheet test was visual practiced precise, with grandmother detecting the exact moment when drop behavior changed from individual to merged, indicating gel point. The assessment required split-second decision because jelly that cooked beyond sheet stage became overcooked, resulting in tough texture. She performed the test every 2 minutes near expected completion, dipping multiple spoons to confirm that sheet behavior was consistent rather than temporary. Concentration from stirring made instant judgment about removing jelly from heat based purely on observing how liquid fell from spoon without any measurement equipment. It cost nothing. Perfect jelly without thermometer, preventing ruined batches worth $2 equivalent to $18 today. Grandmother restored honey monthly in 1967, survival-driven preservation practice that used warm water immersion for liquefying crystallized honey through gentle heating that dissolved sugar crystals without destroying enzymes that high heat would damage. She placed crystallized honey jars in warm water baths, maintained at specific temperature she assessed by hand. Warm but not hot to touch meant perfect for honey restoration. Left jars until crystals dissolved completely through slow heating that preserved honey quality, knew instinctively the exact water temperature and timing needed without thermometers, because too hot water destroyed honey's beneficial properties, while too cool water failed to dissolve crystals effectively. The honey restoration was gentle, slow practiced, with grandmother maintaining water temperature through sensory monitoring, adding hot water gradually to maintain warmth without overheating, checking honey liquefaction, progress through jar observation until golden liquid flowed freely, indicating complete crystal dissolution. Grandmother tested baking powder before baking in 1965, survival-driven quality practice that used water reaction for determining leavening viability without trusting expiration dates that didn't exist or old containers that might have lost potency. She spooned baking powder into water glasses, observed bubble formation immediately. Vigorous bubbling meant fresh active powder. Weak bubbling meant reduced activity requiring extra powder. No bubbling meant completely inactive requiring replacement. Knew instantly whether baking powder would leaven properly through simple chemical test that prevented cake failures from inactive leavening. The freshness test was instant visual reliable with active baking powder, producing immediate vigorous bubbles from acid-base reaction. Grandmother making split-second assessment about powder quality and adjusting recipe accordingly or discarding inactive powder. The test revealed baking powder condition that couldn't be determined by appearance or age alone because humidity exposure and temperature fluctuations affected activity regardless of purchase date, giving grandmother certainty about leavening before investing hours in cake that wouldn't rise because inactive baking powder couldn't generate carbon dioxide. These first 25 kitchen instincts weren't just useful skills, they were evidence of complete sensory mastery that made grandmother's hands, eyes, ears, nose, and tongue more reliable than measurement equipment because her calibrated senses detected variables that tools couldn't measure and adjusted for conditions that written instructions couldn't anticipate. They required decades of practice that transformed conscious technique into unconscious competence, where grandmother performed complex chemical and physical assessments without conscious thought, because the knowledge was embedded so deeply that explaining it seemed impossible when asking, "How do you know?" produced only "you just know," because the instinct operated below conscious awareness in realm of practiced expertise that cannot be transmitted through words. Grandmother transformed leftovers every morning in 1966. Survival-driven creativity practice that used intuitive ingredient pairing for creating new meals from previous dinners without recipes or written guidance, knowing instinctively which leftovers combined successfully and which combinations would fail through flavor memory and experience that operated below conscious thought. She surveyed refrigerator contents, mentally assembled combinations, executed transformations instantly. Monday's roast chicken became Tuesday's chicken salad, Wednesday's hash, Thursday's soup. Through progression, she understood instinctively without following recipes, because decades of leftover management taught her which flavors harmonized, which textures needed refreshing, and how much additional ingredients would stretch yesterday's meal into today's dinner that seemed entirely new despite being built from scraps. The kitchen featured no meal planning, No recipe consultation, just instinctive combination that transformed potential waste into planned meals through expertise that appeared effortless but required years of practice that younger women struggled to replicate because the knowledge couldn't be written as formulas when it existed as intuitive understanding of ingredient compatibility. The leftover transformation was instant creative practice with grandmother making split-second decisions about combinations that never failed, because her internal database of successful pairings guided every choice, producing meals that family never recognized as yesterday's scraps because presentation and complementary fresh ingredients disguised the foundation. She knew that chicken needed acid brightness for salad, carbohydrate stretching for hash, aromatic depth for soup, adjustments she made automatically without conscious analysis because the technique was embedded through thousands of repetitions. Monday's pot roast became Tuesday's shepherd's pie, became Wednesday's beef barley soup through transformations that used every scrap while creating meals that seemed planned rather than improvised, and she timed transformations perfectly so leftovers never spoiled before reuse, but weren't served so frequently that family recognized the repetition. It cost nothing, eliminated 50 cents daily waste, equivalent to $6 today. Grandmother seasoned every dish in 1968. Survival-driven flavor practice that used palm pinch taste progression for achieving perfect seasoning without measuring spoons through taste memory inherited from her mother and calibrated through thousands of dishes. She seasoned by pinching salt from dishes, estimating amounts through hand feel that measured volume through tactile memory. Tasted constantly throughout cooking, making micro-adjustments that brought dishes to exact family preference without conscious measurement because her internal calibration was so precise that written measurements seemed absurd when her pinches were more accurate than spoons. The technique appeared casual, pinch of salt, pinch of pepper, dash of this and that, but represented sophisticated sensory assessment where grandmother simultaneously evaluated current seasoning level, predicted how flavors would develop during cooking, and adjusted for ingredient variables like tomato acidity or meat saltiness that required compensation, all while appearing to season carelessly, because the complex calculation was unconscious expertise that years of practice made automatic. The seasoning instinct was precise, practiced invisible, with grandmother's pinches delivering consistent amounts despite no measurement, her dishes tasting identical batch after batch through calibration so refined that family could detect when someone else cooked, because different hand-pinch volumes produced noticeable flavor shifts. She understood salt-dissolving speed, knowing that seasoning early required less salt than seasoning late because dispersion improved absorption, adjusted for salt type. Fine table salt was twice as strong per pinch as coarse kosher salt, and compensated for ingredient moisture that affected how much seasoning dishes needed, all through intuitive calculation that operated faster than conscious thought. Her taste testing wasn't random sampling, but systematic assessment at specific cooking stages when intervention would be most effective, and she knew that under-seasoned dishes could be corrected, but over-seasoned dishes were ruined, requiring complete restart or severe dilution that wasted ingredients and time. It cost nothing. Perfect seasoning without measurement waste, preventing ruined dishes worth $2 equivalent to $18 today. It demonstrated your cooking mastery when seasoning instinct proved you possessed taste memory that connected your palate to your hand through generational knowledge inheritance, that made you capable of replicating your mother's dishes precisely despite her having never written measurements, because the knowledge lived in practiced pinches rather than written formulas. Grandmother organized storage instinctively in 1969, survival-driven preservation practice that used intuitive understanding of ethylene production, moisture requirements, and temperature sensitivity for storing foods in compatible groups without written compatibility charts. She stored apples away from other produce, knowing they released gas that accelerated ripening, kept potatoes and onions separated, understanding their mutual spoilage acceleration, grouped leafy vegetables in high humidity zones and fruits in low humidity areas through knowledge she couldn't articulate but practiced flawlessly because decades of storage observation taught her which foods preserved, which combinations caused premature spoilage through chemical interactions. She couldn't explain scientifically, but understood instinctively through pattern recognition that made her refrigerator and pantry organization seem random. It was actually sophisticated arrangement that maximized food life through strategic placement. It demonstrated your household knowledge when storage instinct proved you understood food preservation science through observation rather than consulting charts that didn't exist, or following rules that couldn't account for the complexity of managing diverse inventory in single refrigerator with variable temperature zones and humidity levels that grandmother assessed and adjusted instinctively. Intuitive storage knowledge decreased when refrigerators became larger in the 1980s and abundance made spoilage less critical. The skill that once proved household mastery demonstrated your household knowledge when storage instinct proved you understood food preservation science through observation rather than consulting charts that didn't exist, or following rules that couldn't account for the complexity of managing diverse inventory in single refrigerator with variable temperature zones and humidity levels that grandmother assessed and adjusted instinctively. Intuitive storage knowledge decreased when refrigerators became larger in the 1980s and abundance made spoilage less critical. The skill that once proved household mastery became rare expertise, something produce managers understand, but home cooks never develop because modern refrigerators' size makes strategic organization seem unnecessary, and abundance makes spoilage acceptable rather than tragedy, requiring the sophisticated storage instinct grandmother developed through years of managing scarce ingredients in small refrigerators where placement mistakes caused food loss families couldn't afford. Through strategic portion control by grandmother, portioned meals by observation in 1964. Survival-driven allocation practice that used visual assessment for dividing limited food into equal servings that appeared generous while ensuring everyone ate adequately without running short. She eyeballed portions that looked substantial but actually contained less food than they appeared through strategic plating that used visual tricks, spreading food across plates, mounding vegetables for height, arranging components to maximize visual impact, creating impression of abundance from limited ingredients through presentation skills that made scarce resources seem adequate, while ensuring food lasted until next shopping day or paycheck. The portion control was invisible, mathematical, strategic, with grandmother performing complex calculation while appearing to casually serve plates, her eye measuring exact amounts that totaled to available food divided by number of servings needed for current meal, plus planned leftovers for next day's transformation. She understood visual perception, knowing that wide, shallow mounds looked larger than compact piles despite equal volume, and used serving dishes strategically so food appeared abundant in containers rather than sparse in oversized bowls that emphasized scarcity. It cost nothing. Extended food supplies by 20%, saving $2 weekly equivalent to $24 today. It demonstrated your household mastery when portion control proved you could multiply scarce resources through visual manipulation and strategic allocation that no written formula could capture because the technique required simultaneous assessment of food quantity, family nutrition needs, and future meal planning that grandmother integrated unconsciously. Strategic portioning vanished when abundance eliminated the necessity in the 1980s and unlimited seconds became acceptable. Grandmother cooked without timers in 1967, survival-driven temporal practice that used auditory, olfactory, and intuitive monitoring for tracking multiple dishes simultaneously without clocks through sensory awareness that made written timing instructions irrelevant. She managed four-dish dinners through sound progression. Boiling potatoes bubbled loudly, then quieted when done. Roasting chicken sizzled intensely, then softened when ready. Baking bread released yeasty smell, then toasted aroma indicating completion. Orchestrating perfect timing through sensory symphony, she conducted unconsciously while appearing to work casually, because decades of practice embedded cooking rhythms so deeply that timing became automatic intuition, requiring no conscious attention. The technique was holistic awareness, where grandmother tracked everything through peripheral sensory monitoring that operated continuously while she worked on individual tasks, her subconscious processing sounds and smells that signaled each dish's progress and alerted her conscious attention only when intervention was needed. Creating seamless cooking flow where everything finished simultaneously despite no timer coordination because her internal sense of elapsed time and sensory progress monitoring made mechanical timing devices redundant. Creating seamless cooking flow where everything finished simultaneously despite no timer coordination because her internal sense of elapsed time and sensory progress monitoring made mechanical timing devices redundant. The intuitive timing was precise, unconscious, practiced, with grandmother knowing exactly when to check each dish through sensory cues that signaled readiness, moments before visual inspection would confirm it. Smell shift from raw to done, sound change from active cooking to completion, even air temperature fluctuation near oven indicating when baking finished, allowing her to move between tasks with perfect efficiency because sensory monitoring eliminated wasted motion checking dishes that weren't ready. She understood cooking duration variability, knowing that written times were approximations that ignored variables like ingredient temperature, weather-affected oven performance, and batch size differences, making her sensory assessment more reliable than clock watching, that couldn't detect when dish reached proper doneness, faster or slower than recipe predicted. Her timing integrated complex factors, including carryover cooking that required removing dishes before they reached final temperature because residual heat would complete cooking, and she sequenced tasks through backwards planning where final serving time determined when each component started through mental calculation that accounted for different cooking durations and holding times. It cost nothing, eliminated timer dependence, saving $5 for kitchen timer equivalent to $40 today. It demonstrated your cooking mastery when intuitive timing proved you had internalized cooking rhythms through thousands of meals until timing became unconscious competence that couldn't be explained because the knowledge operated below conscious thought in realm of practiced expertise where asking, "How do you know when it's done?" produced only, "You can tell," because sensory assessment was so automatic that articulating the cues seemed impossible. Intuitive timing decreased when digital timers became standard kitchen equipment in the 1980s, and timer dependence replaced sensory awareness. The skill that once proved cooking expertise became rare mastery, something professional chefs maintain through deliberate practice. But home cooks never develop because timer reliance eliminates the necessity and opportunity to build sensory awareness that grandmother acquired through years of cooking without mechanical timing devices that made developing internal rhythm and sensory monitoring essential rather than optional skills. These 30 kitchen instincts weren't just useful techniques or clever tricks. They were evidence of complete mastery that made grandmother's kitchen competence appear effortless, because decades of practice transformed conscious technique into unconscious expertise, where complex assessments happened instantaneously through calibrated senses and embedded knowledge that operated below conscious thought. They represented multiplication mathematics that couldn't be written as formulas because the variables were infinite. Ingredient quality, weather conditions, equipment variations, family preferences, available inventory, seasonal constraints, and grandmother's instinct integrated all factors simultaneously while appearing to work casually because the calculation was automatic. The grandmothers who possessed these instincts weren't naturally talented or specially gifted. They were women who cooked 3 meals daily for decades until techniques became embedded so deeply that explaining them seemed impossible because asking, "How do you know?" produced only, "You just know," when the knowledge lived in hands, eyes, nose, ears, and intuition rather than conscious thought. They learned through observation and repetition in era when written recipes were suggestions rather than formulas, when ingredient standardizations that grandmother adjusted automatically through practiced expertise couldn't satisfy daughters who wanted precise instructions for knowledge that existed beyond words. These weren't just techniques, they were proof that true mastery operates through instinct developed over decades